this tonight is really going to be the last time that we are going to see or hear from Nebuchadnezzar. This is his last mention, his big hurrah right here in chapter 4, and so this will be it. Now, there is some debate as to whether, I'm just going to tell you up front, there is some debate as to whether this is the Nebuchadnezzar, the one we read about here in chapter 4. There's debate as to whether this is the same Nebuchadnezzar that we read about in chapters 1 through 3. And what they're saying is they're not sure. There are some who believe that it is the same Nebuchadnezzar. There are some who believe that this is actually Nabonidus, who some scholars believe called himself also Nebuchadnezzar and called himself what would be Nebuchadnezzar III. There are some arguments to be made for that this could be Nabonidus in Daniel chapter 4. And I'm not going to get too much into that, but I believe personally from the wording of Daniel chapter 4 that this is an event that likely took place some 30 years after Nebuchadnezzar that we see in chapters 1 through 3 put the Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace. So I believe it is the same Nebuchadnezzar, and that is what I'm going with. But just from the wording and the way he puts certain things in this chapter, I believe it is the same Nebuchadnezzar. And from what we understand, this did take place about 30 years after those boys were put in the fire by Nebuchadnezzar. He is now at this point in chapter 4 nearing the end of his reign. Daniel is no longer a young man. Daniel would now be in his 50s at this point. And now that he is no longer the young teenager, God has prospered him. And God has allowed him to stay close to the king and to have influence in the king's life for an extended period of time. And that is where we find him. And as we get into what we're going to be looking at tonight, C.S. Lewis wrote this. He said, "There is one vice of which no man in this world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when they see it in others, and of which hardly any people, except some Christians, even imagine that they are guilty themselves. There is no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves, and the more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others." The sin that C.S. Lewis was referring to was the sin of pride. In fact, the scriptures are in great agreement with C.S. Lewis about this subject of pride. In Proverbs chapter 6, the writer of Proverbs mentions 7 things which God hates. Now, I don't know about you, but if I see or I hear that there is a list of things that God Almighty hates, in my mind, the first thing I'm thinking is, I better pay attention to that list, right? And so when we hear there's a list of things that God hates, the first thing we want to say is, okay, well, what's on that list? Well, the very first thing on that list of things that God hates is a proud look. Pride. Of all the things God could put on his list of things he hates, the very first thing he lists is pride. That should tell us something about how God feels about pride right there, right? That tells us a few things. To us, we can understand why lying makes the list. We can understand why murder makes the list. But pride? Why is pride on this list? And why is it the first thing? Notice what the Apostle Peter wrote in his first epistle to the Christians in Asia Minor. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, he tells them to be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Listen, Peter tells the Christians to resist, that God resists the proud. That word resist literally means to oppose. It means to do battle with. Think about that. God sets himself in opposition against pride. You could put it this way: God goes to war with pride. That's what it means when he says God resists the proud. And as we look at Daniel chapter 4 tonight, that is exactly what we are going to see. God declares war with Nebuchadnezzar's pride. And he does battle with it. And I think we know which way this story goes. Only one side is going to win. It's either God or Nebuchadnezzar. I think we can pretty much figure out who wins this battle, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and let's begin. We're going to go ahead and read, beginning Daniel chapter 4 and verse 1. Now, I want you to be patient with me. You can see on your notes, our notes are not going to start until verse 28. So we're going to spend a little time just talking about these first 27 verses, and then we're going to dive into the meat of the message there towards the end. All right, so Daniel chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs and how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts on my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore, I issued a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers came in, and I told them the dream, but they did not make known to me its interpretation. But at last Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream before him, saying, and let me stop here. This is one of those statements of why I believe this is the same Nebuchadnezzar as chapters 1 through 3. Because he says he has the name of my God, which applies here. When you come to Nabonidus did not worship the same God as Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 1 through 3. He worshiped the god Sin, which was the moon god, which, remember, we talked about that moon god went all the way back into Babylon, into the Tower of Babel days, all right, and to Abraham's days. They worshiped two different gods, and so this God that he's referencing he's named after the God that Nebuchadnezzar named him after. So that's why I believe it is the same Nebuchadnezzar. Anyway, verse 9. Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you. And I know some of your translations probably say spirit of the whole of the gods or holy gods. It is plural there in the original language. So he's not referencing Jehovah per se, but he is referencing that he has the spirit of the gods within him as far as he's concerned. And no secret troubles you. Explain to me the visions of my dream that I have seen and its interpretation. These were the visions of my head while on my bed. I was looking, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of all the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head while on my bed, and there was a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts get out from under it and the birds from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from that of a man. Let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. Let's stop there for a moment. Chapter 4 is an interesting chapter because, as you just read, chapter 4 begins in the first person. But it's unique in that it is the first person account of who? Of Nebuchadnezzar. This is Nebuchadnezzar's first-hand account. While the book of Daniel, as we've talked about, is ascribed to have been written by Daniel, chapter 4, possibly with Daniel's assistance and under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, I find it interesting that chapter 4 is not written by Daniel, it's written by Nebuchadnezzar. Sometimes we don't grasp that and get that concept. Nebuchadnezzar wrote a chapter in our Bible. Nevertheless, in chapter 4, we find this document that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, writes. And he writes this because he wants this letter to be distributed throughout the entire kingdom. That's why he says in verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. This is for everybody. This is a letter that he wants copied and distributed and sent out. He wants the people he's leading to know about something that has recently happened in his life. He just had his world rocked, and he wants everyone to know what's taken place. And so he writes this document, and in this letter to every people, nation, and language under his dominion, he tells them, guess what? I had another troubling dream. They remember, and some people may remember, I imagine most of the people don't know, but we remember he's had trouble with dreams before. And now here he is 30 years later having another troubling dream. And unlike the dream he had in chapter 2, which involved a great statue, Nebuchadnezzar now dreams of a great tree. This tree was beautiful. It had large leafy branches. This tree reached up to the heavens. It could be seen from across the known world. That was what it was implying. It was so great that every part of the earth could see this tree. It was such a great tree that the birds, they all came to make their nests in the tree. The beasts all came to it. All the animals came to get underneath it for its shade. It was good to supply food to anyone and everyone who needed it. It was a beautiful and grand tree. But then in his dream, this tree, this beautiful, magnificent tree, gets cut down, and only a stump remains. Well, just as he did in chapter 2, in his mind, this dream terrifies him. He has a very bad feeling that this dream is about him. And he wants to know what is going on in this dream. What does it mean? And so he approaches the guys who, just as in chapter 2, these guys whose job is to tell him such things. He calls in the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and all those guys, and he brings them in to come in and interpret the dream. But this time, they didn't have any answers for him. Remember, who is the boss of the wise men now? It's Daniel. Remember, after he successfully told the dream and interpreted the dream in chapter 2, Daniel gets put in charge of all the wise men. 30 years later, Daniel's still in charge. He's still the head wise man. And so, I have a feeling that when these guys heard the dream and they hear that, I think they knew that if they gave a fake interpretation, I think they knew if they consulted their little books that told them what dreams were supposed to mean, they would know that Daniel might come in and tell the king, hey, king, these guys just made all that up. Not a word of that was truth. Let me tell you what the dream really means. Now, what do you want to do with these guys? So they admit, listen, We don't know what it means, king. We're not going to try and make anything up. We're not going to try and fool you. We have no idea what this dream means. Then Daniel finally comes in before the king. Now, we don't know why Daniel didn't come in with the wise men to begin with. Perhaps he had been away and not able to come right away. Perhaps Nebuchadnezzar called in the lower wise men thinking they could handle this problem, and then when they couldn't, Daniel comes in. Maybe Daniel just finally hears what's happening. He'd been a little busy and it shows up, but no matter what, Daniel finally arrives, and when Daniel walks in, Nebuchadnezzar is relieved. He's like, all right, now I can get some answers. Here's the guy who can give me answers about my dream. Because if there's anyone who can do this, it's Daniel. Now, look with me at verse 18. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, Daniel, declare its interpretation, since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation. But you are able, for the Spirit of the Holy God is in you. After 30 years of working with Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar knows that Daniel has a special relationship with his God. It may not be Nebuchadnezzar's God, but Nebuchadnezzar understands Daniel's got a special relationship with the divine. And so he knows that Daniel can reveal this dream. And this narrative, after this verse, it moves away from the first person for verses 19 through 27, where we see Daniel's interpretation of the dream he gave to Nebuchadnezzar. Then at the end of the chapter, this first person account is going to pick back up as Nebuchadnezzar closes out the document that he wants to send out. So what does the dream mean? Well, here's the Cliff Notes version of verses 19 through 27, okay? Daniel says, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, that tree that you dreamed of, that's you, buddy. That represents you and the greatness of your kingdom. But that tree is going to be cut down. But don't lose hope. There is hope, King, because while the tree is going to be cut down, there's a stump that's going to remain. And this is what's going to happen to you, Nebuchadnezzar. This is what the dream means. You're going to be removed from your role as king. And you're going to be driven into the wilderness where you're going to live like a beast of the field. You're going to live like an animal, King Nebuchadnezzar. You're going to be mentally insane, acting like a cow that grazes on the grass. And for 7 times or 7 periods, you're going to be off the throne, living in the wilderness like an animal and out of your mind. How would you feel if someone came and told you for the next 7 years you're going to be cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs? You're going to be out of it. You're just going to be insane, going around in the field, eating grass like a cow and mooing and whatever else it is. I don't know. Chewing your cud. I have no idea. But you're going to be out in the beast acting like a fool. How would you feel in that moment? Can I get a second opinion? Yeah, can I get a second opinion? Now, this isn't part of my notes, but I find it interesting. When the king told Daniel the dream, notice in verse 19, it says, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. I love this. Listen, that word astonished, it means that he was concerned. This bothered him. He was afraid, but I believe that when we see this, he was afraid to tell the king. And look what he says. So the king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, don't let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. And Belteshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concerning your enemies. See, remember, Daniel's worked with Nebuchadnezzar for over 30 years. And while Nebuchadnezzar may not be a believer in Jehovah, I think Daniel, did he have a little fear for his life about what the message was he had to give? Yeah, probably a little bit. But I think Daniel was more concerned for Nebuchadnezzar. He's worked with him for 30 years, and he goes to the king and says, King, I wish this interpretation, I wish this dream was about your enemies. But it's not. It's about you. And then he gives this dream and tells him, you're going to be acting like an animal in the wild. You're going to be insane. So what does Nebuchadnezzar do with this information? What would you do with it? Would you take the wait and see approach? I find it interesting. Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, here's what the dream means. Now, if you want to do yourself a favor, go ahead and repent now. Repent now, and God may extend your time. Does Nebuchadnezzar do that? No. Does he beg God for mercy? No. Look at what happens beginning in verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of the 12 months, listen, 1 year later, 1 year after he shared his dream with Daniel and Daniel interpreted it, a year later, he, Nebuchadnezzar, was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. And the king spoke, saying, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? So, did this terrifying dream humble the king? No. I imagine when he first heard the interpretation, I imagine he went to bed a few nights worried that the next day he was going to wake up insane. But days went by, nothing happened. Weeks went by, nothing happened. Months go by, nothing happens. I imagine at some point Nebuchadnezzar either forgot all about the dream, or Nebuchadnezzar assumed, yeah, God must have changed his mind, or maybe Daniel didn't know what he was talking about after all. And here he is, and a year has gone by, nothing has happened, and he finds himself walking around proud of the kingdom he's created, proud of his achievements, proud of his accomplishments. And that's the moment that this dream finally becomes reality. So what I want to do with the rest of our time tonight is to look at this passage, and I want to see how God deals with Nebuchadnezzar. Because as we watch how God deals with Nebuchadnezzar, it's going to reveal to us how God deals with pride. I titled this message tonight, God's Battle Against Pride. And that's ultimately what we see here. This passage reveals what God does to battle against pride and how this whole thing takes place. And so the first thing that we need to see tonight is this. Nebuchadnezzar exemplified, I put exemplifies, either one works, exemplifies or exemplified pride. It's in this story that we see what pride really looks like. We just read it in verses 28 through 30, right? Those verses are just full of pride. Nebuchadnezzar is out walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. By the way, he had 3 royal palaces in the city of Babylon. He's walking along on the roof of one of his palaces, though, and he's looking out at the great city that he's built up. Now, understand, Babylon was truly a sight to behold. It was a beautiful city. It is said that there were around 2 million people living in Babylon at this time. Surrounding the city was a giant moat filled with water. There were 2 sets of walls going around the city that provided a double layer of protection. The walls were so wide that chariots could run back and forth on top of the walls with plenty of space besides. The walls were matched by 100 gates of solid brass. 100 gates of solid brass. 25 gates on each side of the city. And a straight road ran from each gate to the opposite gate. And these roads intersected each other, dividing the city into 676 squares. But it was the spectacular hanging gardens that have been hailed for centuries as one of the wonders of the world. These hanging gardens, they had successive terraces that rose one above another, until they reached as high as the walls. They were then filled with soil and planted with every kind of tree and flower. And when finished, the hanging gardens looked like a mountain filled with luxurious vegetation. All of that was built for Nebuchadnezzar's wife. And so Nebuchadnezzar, he's looking around at this grand, beautiful city that's got defenses that nobody can match. And he says, "Look what I've done. I am great. I am the greatest that can be. And this city reflects my greatness." You want to, and listen, I don't like to get political, but I'm going to tell you this. There are a lot of similarities between Donald Trump and Nebuchadnezzar. I'm not taking a political side here. I'm just telling you, you listen to Donald Trump talk. It's going to be the greatest ever. Look at all I've done. Look at everything I've done. Look at all I've built. It sounds just like Nebuchadnezzar, doesn't it? Look what I've done. I'm great. Look at how great my buildings are. This is what pride really looks like. Let me share with you a few thoughts about this. What is pride? If Nebuchadnezzar exemplifies it, what is it? First of all, pride is taking credit. Pride is taking credit. Look what it says in verse 30. Is not this great Babylon that I have built? He looks around at the city. Look at the city I have built. Archaeologists have found many of the stones that were used for building in ancient Babylon. And they've discovered that many of the stones used to erect many of those buildings have the name Nebuchadnezzar stamped on the bricks, on those stones. That was who he was. He wanted his name all over the city. He wanted the credit for how beautiful and how grand this city had become. So he looks around and he says, "Look what I have done." That's what pride really is. It's taking credit for something you shouldn't be taking credit for. Pride is when we fail to recognize that we couldn't have achieved anything we did if it weren't for God. Remember what Daniel told King Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 about his dream? He told him that it was God who had established him. He told him all the way back in chapter 2, 30 years prior, King Nebuchadnezzar, it's my God, Jehovah, who put you on this throne. It's my God who has given you all these victories. It's my God who has put you in this place of power. He is the one who has set you up and allowed you to do everything you've done. And now here he is 30 years later, and he's taking credit for what God had established. Look what I have done. That's unfortunately where a lot of people, including Christians, live their lives. A lot of people live their lives full of pride in their accomplishments. But listen to what Paul warns the church at Corinth about pride as he tries to correct them. The church at Corinth, listen, they were filled with pride. They had pride. They were proud of their spiritual gifts. They were proud of their leaders. They had arguments over whose leader was better. And there was a lot of dissension in the church, all because these people were filled with pride. Whose gift is better? Whose leader is better? And Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 6 and 7. He says, "Now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up." That's a picture of pride. He says, listen, none of you should be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. For who makes you differ from another? And what do you have that you did not receive? Now, if you did indeed receive it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? In other words, he's saying, listen, church at Corinth, you've got all this pride built up about your gifts, your accomplishments, your wisdom, your leaders, but listen to me. Everything you have, it comes from God. What do you have that you didn't actually receive from God himself? That spiritual gift you're so proud of, that's from God. Those leaders you have, they're from God. Why are you so puffed up about something that has nothing to do with you and it has everything to do with God? Now, I know there are some who would say, well, listen, you don't understand. I've worked hard for some things I have. I am the one who earned this. I'm the one who did this. I'm the one who accomplished this. No one gave me anything. But here's the problem with that line of thought. Who allowed your heart to beat while you did those things? It was God. Who filled your lungs with air while you did those things? Who gave you the mind and the ability to do the things you do? The answer is God, right? So without God, we are nothing and have nothing. Anything good that happens in our life is simply a reflection of God's grace in our lives. Let me ask you, do we really want to take credit for God's grace in our lives? That's what pride does. It takes credit for what God has done. Now, that does not mean we shouldn't pursue worthy accomplishments. In fact, the Scriptures teach us that we are to do everything with excellence and to do it heartily as unto the Lord. That means, listen, you put your heart and mind, you put everything, if you're going to set your mind to do something, you do it and you do it right. And you do it with excellence. But we must always remember that we can't go anywhere or do anything apart from God's grace in our lives. So when you achieve something, instead of saying, look what I've done, we should be saying, God, you have been so good. That's the difference. So pride is taking credit. Secondly, pride is seeking praise for yourself. It's seeking praise for yourself. Again, looking at verse 30, is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? Who does Nebuchadnezzar want to receive honor, glory, and praise? It's not God, it's himself, right? I want my name to be great. I did all of this. I built the city. I did all of these things to make my name great. I want the praise. Pride is the desire to be praised when it's God who ought to be praised. Listen, we've known enough people that their pride, and how often have we done the same thing? We do something and we want someone to just come up and say, man, that was a great job you did. I'm going to tell you right now, there's a lot of preachers who get caught in this trap. They live for the compliments as people walk out the door. Man, that was a great message, Pastor. And they live for that building up, and they preach to try to get that praise. I want my name to be great. That's what Nebuchadnezzar's doing. He wants the honor for himself. So pride is seeking praise for yourself. Thirdly, pride is thinking that it's all about you. Pride is thinking it's all about you. Again, look at verse 40. Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm making a big deal about me. It's all about me. It's my name that's on the bricks of this city. I'm the one who commissioned the beautiful hanging gardens. Look at me. But humility says, I don't want the attention. It's not all about me. I'm just using what God has given me for his great name. It's not about me. It's all about Jesus. That's the difference between pride and humility. Now, we see that Nebuchadnezzar exemplified pride. Let me show you, secondly, God humbles the proud. God humbles the proud. Look with me, verse 31. While the word was still in the king's mouth. Man, that's crazy, right? Right while the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever he chooses. That very hour, the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. The very hour in which Nebuchadnezzar stood on his grand palace, and he stood there in that very hour that he declared how great he was, God humbles him. God says, you think you're all that? Let me show you who's truly great. Let me show you what happens to your pride. And in this moment, he lost his authority as king and was driven by his own madness out into the wilderness. Here again, we see the sovereignty of God. In any other kingdom, let's be clear, in any other kingdom, if the king had gone insane and went out in the field and started eating like a beast, wouldn't they have killed him so they could assume the throne for themselves? That doesn't happen here. Why? Because God is sovereign. God said it's going to be 7 periods. It's going to be 7 years. And then you're going to remember. You're going to recognize who God really is. And you'll get that throne restored to you. God is overseeing all of this. So in any other kingdom, he would have been eliminated. But instead, God provided someone to rule while Nebuchadnezzar was away. And listen, there's scholarly debate as to who that individual was. But someone had to step in and reign while he was insane. But he didn't just lose his throne. He lost his sanity. He lost his dignity. He's out in the wilderness eating grass like a cow. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to do that. I hope no one in here has tried to do that. But he's out there in the wilderness trying to eat grass like a cow. His nails and his hair are growing freakishly long. Anyone ever thought about not getting a haircut for 7 years? You ever thought about not trimming your nails for 7 years? Listen, he is literally insane, and for 7 years he lives and acts like an animal, which brings us to an important truth. When God humbles the proud, it's often painful. When God has to come in and humble you because of your pride, let me tell you, it's probably going to hurt. There's going to be some pain involved in that humbling. When we fail to keep our pride in check, we face a painful humiliation. That's what happens here in chapter 4. Old Testament scholar Stephen Miller said something to this effect. He said, King Nebuchadnezzar learned a very painful lesson, that God hates pride. And because of that, he will humble those who refuse to acknowledge God's sovereignty. When people today still live prideful lives, they soon discover that God still humbles the proud. Sometimes we look at this story and we think, well, that was Nebuchadnezzar. Can I tell you something? God is still in the business of humbling those who are full of pride. He's still in the business of doing that. When we get prideful, God has a way of humbling us, doesn't he? And that humbling process is never pleasant. But God, in his grace, either allows the humbling or causes the humbling to take place in your life because he is opposed to the pride in your life. He knows what unchecked pride will lead to. He knows the damage it can do. And so in his grace, he tries to get our attention by humbling us. And that is always a painful experience. So we see Nebuchadnezzar exemplified pride. God humbles the proud. Then thirdly, God has a purpose in the humbling. God has a purpose in the humbling. Why does God humble the proud? Listen, Let me break this down, and I didn't put this in your notes. Why does God hate pride so much? Let me give you one basic reason. And listen, there's more of the reasons than this. But one basic reason that stands out, because I believe pride is one of the biggest and probably the biggest thing that keeps people from salvation. People think, I don't need Jesus. I don't need God. I'm good on my own. I'm okay as I am. I'm a pretty good person. You hear that? I'm okay. I don't need all that. We have enough pride in our lives that we say, you know what? I don't need what God says He's offering. Pride has kept, I believe this, I believe pride has sent an awful lot of people straight to hell because they failed to see their need for Jesus. That's why He does battle with the proud and with pride. Now, why does God humble the proud? I believe God deals with pride because it robs God of the ultimate glory that He deserves. So let me give you this point. He humbles the proud to return the glory God deserves back to Him. Remember, we said pride is seeking praise for yourself. Well, when God humbles you, He's trying to return that honor, that glory, back where it belongs, on Him, on God. Look at verse 34 and 35. And at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored Him who lives forever. For His dominion is an everlasting dominion, and His kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to His will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain His hand or say to Him, what have you done? Listen, this once proud king, he is humbled. And suddenly, his whole attitude, his whole demeanor change. He's now not seeking praise for himself. He's now giving the one true God all the glory and honor and praise that is due His name. In fact, look at what it says in verse 36 and 37. At the same time, my reason returned to me. My sanity came back. And for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and His ways justice, and those who walk in pride He is able to put down. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar is saying. I may have gotten my kingdom back. I may have gotten my throne back. All my advisors may have brought me back. I may have my sanity now. But here's something I know now that I didn't understand or admit back then. I'm just another king under the authority of the King of heaven. I may have a kingdom again, but God's kingdom is the kingdom, as verse 34 says, that has an everlasting dominion. I may have power again, but God's power is an unstoppable power. No one can restrain His hand. No one can stop the God of heaven from doing what He wants to do. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar gives God the ultimate glory as the supreme authority that reigns over this universe. That's why God deals with our pride, so that we will give Him the glory that He ultimately deserves. But there's another reason God deals with pride and humbles the proud. I want you to look with me at verse 2. It's very easy to miss this as we read through this chapter, but there's an important detail that we find all the way back in verse 2. Look at what it says. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has what? has worked for me. Let me give you this thought. Why does God deal with pride? Because he wants to show that he cares for us. One of his purposes in dealing with pride and humbling the proud is he wants to show he cares for us. Nebuchadnezzar, right at the very beginning of this document that he's going to send out to the entire nation, the whole story, as what he says, listen, this whole story that I'm about to tell you, it unfolded for me. God did all this for me. I needed to be humbled, and God actually did it. Here is a wicked, ungodly king who sees God's personal touch in his life. Now, there are some who believe that Nebuchadnezzar became a full-fledged believer in Yahweh at this point. Here's what I'm going to say. There can be debate back and forth of whether he became a believer or not. I believe there is no way for us to truly know what happened in the heart of Nebuchadnezzar. We don't know if this was a temporary thing or if it lasted, but we do know this from what we read here. Nebuchadnezzar came to a place in his life. He came to this point in his life where he believed that Daniel's God, the Most High God, dealt with people on an individual basis. He came to a place in his life where he realized that the one all-true, powerful God actually cared about him. Because this same God who humbled him could have just killed him, right? But this God came to him and he offered him a chance of redemption. He offered him a chance to do what was right and give praise and honor and glory to God. Nebuchadnezzar, he says, listen, everything I'm about to tell you, he did this because he cares about me. Have you come to that place in your life where you realize and understand that the one true God of heaven cares about you? He knows you by name. He knows the number of hairs on your head, if you have any. He knows your past. He knows what you're facing today. And he cares about you. And because he cares about you, he will do what he needs to do in order to get your attention and deal with your pride. Sometimes God uses hard things in our lives to break down the pride in our lives so we can see our need for him. Listen, maybe you're here tonight. Maybe you're going through something right now. Have you considered that maybe God is using that to try to get you to open your ears and to get you to pay more attention to him and less attention to yourself? Maybe you haven't been listening to what the Lord has told you, just as Nebuchadnezzar so many times ignored the words of God through Daniel. Even after this dream that he had, I told you, Daniel pleaded with Nebuchadnezzar to repent. But Nebuchadnezzar refused to listen to Daniel. And so God came in and he humbled him. God deals with our pride because he cares for us. But there is one more purpose. Quickly, that is to removing our pride makes room for God's mercy. Listen, I can look back over my life and I can see the moments where pride began to take root in my life. And I'm so glad that God didn't just leave me there in my pride. I'm so glad God didn't just leave me there. Instead, God allowed some hard times to come in my life. God allowed some humbling circumstances to come along to grab my attention. Listen, that's God's mercy. Nebuchadnezzar said, I want to tell you about all the great things the Most High God has done for me. Folks, I got to tell you, everything God's done for me, God's mercy has been shown in my life. And folks, I got to speak up, and I got to declare it for my whole nation to hear, That is a wow moment in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. Listen, when God does a humbling work of mercy in your life, guess what you need to do? You need to tell others. Tell others about the mercy God showed you. Because if He can show mercy in your life, guess what? He can show mercy in theirs. That's the point here. It's all about getting glory, honor, and praise to the God of heaven. Next week, we're going to move on to Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5, and we're going to move to Belteshazzar, and not Belteshazzar, what's his name? I'm losing my... Yeah, their names are all like this. Belshazzar, yeah, not Belteshazzar, Belshazzar. Too many bells. Anyway, we're going to look at that next week, all right? Thanks for coming.